If you had a blind spot that caused you to ignorantly put your children's safety and well-being at risk, you'd want to know about it, wouldn't you? As a concerned parent, you'd like to be 100% sure that you're seeing clearly around any blind spots and doing all you can to prepare your children for their lives as adults in a free society. If that's the case, then I invite you to join me in taking a look into our cultural blind spot and consider for half an hour the moral, economic, and political risks involved in educating our children in a compulsion-based school system. And we'll explain what that is. Then I'll tell you about freedom-based schools that have been operating for over 40 years with remarkable results. First, let's talk about what we have now, which is a compulsion-based education system. Where did it come from? How did the land of the free come to adopt a non-freedom-oriented method of education? Most Americans are unaware that our so-called American public school system and the private schools which model themselves after it are in fact not American at all in either origin or operation. Our schools are modeled directly on the Prussian school model developed in the early 1800s. There's actually very little American about them. In 1806, the Principality of Prussia included today's northern Germany, Poland, and a little bit of Russia. That year, Napoleon invaded and whacked the Prussians big time. The Prussian king, Frederick the Great, blamed their loss on his soldiers and bureaucrats, who kept second-guessing the orders of their superiors. A Prussian philosopher, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, claimed the solution for Prussia was to use schools to destroy individual initiative and free will in their students, so that when they became soldiers and bureaucrats, they would follow orders without question. Fichte wrote, "In a word, it is a total change of the existing system of education that I propose as the sole means of preserving the existence of the German nation. The very recognition of and reliance upon free will in the pupil is the first mistake of the old system. The new education must consist essentially in this, that it completely destroys freedom of will." 2 years later, based on Fichte's recommendations, Prussia instituted the world's first tax-funded, government-controlled, compulsory, universal public education system. And just guess which 3 subjects they stressed should be taught: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sound familiar? It should, because 30 years later, Horace Mann, the father of our so-called American public education system, was so enamored by the Prussian model that he sold the idea to American bankers and industrialists, who needed to turn the children of America's independent-minded farmers into obedient clerks and factory workers. They helped Mann get it adopted in Massachusetts, and then helped him spread the model across the entire United States. They knew, though, if they called it what it actually was, socialized education, the freedom-minded Americans would reject it outright. So, they sold the idea by claiming this new system of education offered all Americans equal opportunity. That sounded so American-like that the general public bought it hook, line, and sinker. So that's how we came to adopt a compulsion-based education system which was intended to squash our children's free will. So, before we go any further, we really should define our terms here. What do I mean by the term compulsion-based education? How is the principle of compulsion embedded in our Prussian American school system? It's found on 3 levels. First, universal compulsory education laws. Every child must attend school whether they want to or not. If the child refuses, the parents may be fined or imprisoned. Homeschooling is the only exception. Second, our schools practice compulsory instruction. The teacher assumes the responsibility for the child's education. So it is the teacher who must determine what, where, and how the child is to learn. The child has very little, if any, choice in the matter. And third, the entire school system itself is a compulsion-based organization, a rigid top-down hierarchy patterned organizationally after the typical 19th century corporation, where each level has power over the level below them. In the classroom, the teacher wields the legislative, executive, and judicial power, which by definition makes her a tyrant, however benevolent she may be. Then at the bottom of this rigid power structure comes the student. He is left with only one of four choices: comply, subvert, escape, or rebel. Well, you might reason it can't be all that bad, can it? I mean, everyone has to go through it, right? Let's look at how compulsion is counterproductive to learning. As the old Soviet Union taught us, economic compulsion destroys the incentive to produce. The output of Russian farmers was a mere fraction of the productivity of farmers in the free world. Likewise, educational compulsion can destroy or greatly reduce the individual's incentive to learn. Supporting evidence for this assertion is found in a 2003 survey by the Jenkins Group, which showed that 33% of high school graduates never read another book from cover to cover for the rest of their lives. 42% of college graduates never read another book after college. And 80% of U.S. families did not buy or read a book in the previous year. This strongly suggests that our schools actually deter us from becoming the lifelong learners they profess to make of us. Compulsion-based education robs the child of the responsibility and incentive for self-education. It makes them dependent learners. In other words, education becomes something done to you by someone else, not something you learn to do for yourself. Traditional schools have a strong economic effect as well. We have become a nation of worker bees, trained by well-meaning teachers that our goal in life should be to, quote, get good grades so you can get into a good college so you can get a good job, end quote. U.S. Census data shows that only 3% of high school graduates overcome this conditioning and start a business before the age of 30. No wonder we're always haunted with unemployment. Our schools generate a surplus of employee-minded graduates and a scarcity of those who could employ them. Compulsion-based education also has political consequences. Because our children have 12 years of experience giving in to benevolent dictators, we have become a nation of political passives, people who look to the government to fix all of our problems. Abraham Lincoln warned us of the influence of education over politics when he said, "The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next." And the philosophy underpinning our schools is based on compulsion, not freedom. Let's look at how compulsion-based schools put all our children at risk. My experience as a school teacher in the classroom showed me firsthand that there are 4 ways children respond to authoritarian social systems like a compulsion-based school. All 4 responses serve to corrupt them morally. Response number 1. Comply to the system. These are the good students, those who happen to be good at learning how the teacher happens to be teaching. Instead of being repulsed by the authoritarian system to which they are being subjected, they see it as normal. And when they grow up, they in turn subject their own children to it. The second response: subvert the system. This response turns good people into those willing to lie and cheat to keep their grades up and thus avoid grief from their parents and teachers. When I did my student teaching in Utah County in the mid-1980s, my fellow student teacher discovered that literally half his students were cheating on their math tests. Half. And that was nearly 30 years ago. I suspect lying and cheating in school is even more widespread today. The students don't see it as immoral. They see it as a part of playing the game. Response number 3. Perhaps the most tragic response to an authoritarian system is to withdraw. Drugs and alcohol become a way to escape the misery. Some go all the way and commit suicide to escape their dead-end lives. About 5 years after I graduated, suicide became the popular thing to do in my Texas high school. Dozens of students tragically chose that method of response. The last response to an authoritarian system is to rebel. The kids that choose this response are so disruptive to the learning process that they are frequently expelled from the classroom or school entirely. They often act out using violence in general and bullying in particular. The irony and tragedy is that these students are the ones who sense something is very wrong with their world, but because they were raised in the system, they can't see that it's the system itself that's wrong. Besides the moral risks we take putting our children in compulsion-based schools, there are a number of other risks. Let's quickly review those. By sending our children to compulsion-based schools, we risk them being tormented by bullies who are likely just channeling the abuse they feel from the system. We risk their being offered drugs and alcohol by the escapers. We risk our children being labeled stupid because their learning style doesn't happen to match their teachers. We risk our children getting union-protected teachers who may not care about them or their learning. For these teachers, schools are just a government jobs program. We risk our child being conditioned to dislike learning and to never read a book from cover to cover for the rest of their lives. We risk them getting propagandized for values that we don't share. And finally, we risk our children never discovering and blessing the world with their talents and inner genius because they are never given the freedom and the time to discover and develop those talents. So, we've covered where compulsion-based education came from, what it is, and how it puts our children at risk. Let's now look at the alternative, an education system with a 40-year track record that is more in line with America's founding values of freedom, self-government, and the rule of law. We call it freedom-based education, or it could also be called a free market education. Freedom-based schools use the same educational model as God, or nature if you will, which is clearly seen in the first years of a child's life. Children are little learning machines. They learn the highly complex tasks of understanding and speaking a language, and the complex physical skills of crawling, walking, and running. And what did their Creator give them to learn all these? Teachers, desks, chalkboards, homework, and bells? No. He gave them role models, resources, a safe environment, and the freedom to try, fail, and to try again. Freedom-based education applies the same formula to everything else a child might want to learn. So when a child turns school age, doesn't it seem just a tad arrogant for us to assume we know better than God how His creations should be educated? Those parents who are uncomfortable giving their child intellectual freedom often argue that a child can't possibly be responsible for his or her own education. A counter-argument would be that in order for the child to ever become responsible, we must lay that responsibility squarely on their shoulders, and the best time to do it is when they are young. Freedom-based schools allow the child 100% of the responsibility for their own learning. In doing so, they show respect for the genius of the child's creator. They are essentially allowing the child to fulfill the measure of their creation and have joy therein. What a divine thing to do! So, in a freedom-based school, the child learns to responsibly wield intellectual freedom by determining for themselves what, where, when, and how they learn. Hundreds of children have done this and have turned out just fine. The school's organization, in sharp contrast to a compulsion-based school, is freedom-based. All share equal political power, the power to make, implement, and judge the laws that everyone has to obey. Each person, regardless of age, has an equal vote. No child is compelled to do anything, unless, of course, their safety is at risk. But how can it possibly work? Isn't it chaos? Of course not. The school has a constitutional, law-based government to provide a safe, respectful, and orderly environment. Students make up the majority of the government, so they get plenty of real-world practice being responsible citizens of a free society. Free market schools hire staff members who are themselves role models of people who love to learn, apply, and share knowledge, and who, by their example, entice the children to participate in learning, applying, and sharing knowledge and skills. Staff members are also encouraged to use persuasion, long-suffering, and love unfeigned. Staff members and students offer to teach each other classes on everything from math to interior design to chemistry to cooking. Because the students and staff teach themselves and each other, the tuition for a free market school is about half that of a traditional private school. Kids can sign up for classes they'd like to take, they can spend their time reading books they find interesting, do internships, explore hobbies, build things, write poetry, practice drawing, etc., etc., etc. Naturally, the skeptic in you is protesting. This can't possibly work. But it does. I've seen it work with my own 2 eyes. But to calm your doubts, here's 3 evidences that freedom-based education works. First, Sudbury Valley School is the model for freedom-based education. It has been successfully operating for over 40 years. If it wasn't working, don't you think the parents in the area would have long since abandoned it? Additionally, dozens of copycat schools have cropped up from California to Salt Lake to Maryland, and from New Zealand to Israel and to Japan. A second evidence that this model works just fine is that Sudbury's graduates report that those who chose to go on to college were able to get accepted into the colleges of their first or second choice. The colleges their graduates have received degrees from include Boston College, Brandeis, Yale, Cambridge, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and MIT, to name a few. What I find particularly remarkable is that 42% of Sudbury's graduates start their own businesses by the time they turn 30. That's 14 times the rate of compulsion-based schools, which average 3%, according to the Census Bureau. So it's clear to me that graduates from freedom-based schools are substantially better prepared to function well in a free market economy because they have the focus, confidence, and self-assurance needed to start their own businesses. In case you're worried, every child at Sudbury learns to read and write. There are hundreds of schools in America that cannot make that claim. Interestingly, no child that started there has ever developed dyslexia. They surmise this is because no child is ever compelled there to learn to read before their brains are developmentally ready for it. Okay, we've defined freedom-based education, we've looked at how a free market school functions, and we've reviewed some of the evidences that these schools do their job quite well. Now, let's take a look at the benefits of enrolling children in a freedom-based school. Those benefits extend to the child themselves, their parents, and to society at large. In a freedom-based school, the child becomes a self-driven, responsible, lifelong learner, having fully shouldered their responsibility to learn, grow, and contribute to society. They are also happy there. In fact, there's a story from one of the schools where a mother came to pick up her child after work, and her daughter hugged the leg of a staff member and said, "Mommy, can I please stay longer?" Children who attend a freedom-based school develop the self-confidence, courage, and drive needed to start their own businesses, so they have all the more advantage in our free market economy. By the time they graduate, they know what they want to study in college, so they don't waste their time and your money bouncing from major to major. The parent doesn't have to deal with any of the messes created by the moral corruption of their children mentioned earlier. In a freedom-based school, these risks are dramatically reduced, if not made completely irrelevant, because there is no authoritarian system to respond negatively to. Convenience. As parents, you can drop your children off on your way to work and pick them up on the way back. Go on vacations anytime you want, for as long as you want. There is no makeup work. In fact, there's no hassles at all. Freedom is simple. It's compulsion that's complex. The biggest benefit for the parents, perhaps, is that they can rest assured that their children are happy, safe, and are on their way to finding their God-given talents and gifts with which they can bless the world. The biggest benefit to society economically is perhaps that freedom-based education offers the best long-term solution to unemployment by raising 1,400% more small business owners than our compulsion-based system does at present. If every school in the nation were freedom-based, we'd have lines of employers looking for employees instead of the unemployment lines we have today. Another economic benefit of freedom-based schools for society at large is that small towns that are currently drying up and blowing away all across the Midwestern states would begin to grow and prosper again. Currently, their compulsion-based school graduates have to move away to the big city to find work. With freedom-based schools, their children are more likely to start local businesses and stay put rather than move away. Thus, small towns can retain their most valuable assets, their children. One political benefit to society of freedom-based schools is that their graduates are used to the mechanisms of self-government. They become very familiar with parliamentary procedure and could easily slip into a leadership role if needed. Our freedoms are safer the more graduates we have from freedom-based schools. One last benefit to society is that these graduates are used to being totally responsible for themselves, so it stands to reason that they will be much less likely to become dependent on government as adults. In short, a freedom economy and nation requires freedom-based education. Today I've shown you what's in our society's educational blind spot. The fact that the model of education we adopted from Europe is actually hopelessly outdated and is detrimental to the child, the economy, and the republic. And I've shown you the corresponding alternative, an educational model truly American, based on freedom and self-government, and how it solves most of the problems currently plaguing our schools. So now what? Well, tonight or tomorrow, I invite you to download and ponder the outline for this presentation from freedombasededucation.org. There are other articles there you may want to read as well. Then I would also invite you to decide if you're going to stand on the side of freedom or choose to stay with compulsion. Third, if you choose to stand for freedom, then I invite you to come up with a plan for doing something to promote freedom-based education, or join us in giving energy to our plan. We're working to build a network of self-replicating free market schools. We hope to locate the first one in the southern half of Utah County, and then as they multiply, they will spread out from there. Now I ask you one last thing. Remember, a free economy and nation requires freedom-based education. Thank you.